On the morning of March 28, 1979, Philadelphia homicide detective Michael Chitwood climbed the stairs of a shabby apartment building in the Powelton Village neighborhood and knocked on his second floor door. He had a 35-page search warrant. He had a six-person team behind him, and he had a suspicion that had been growing for 18 months since a 30-year-old woman named Holly Maddux had walked into this building and was never seen again. The man who answered the door was not what you'd expect a murder suspect to look like. He was big, bearded, and talkative, the kind of man who held court at Philadelphia dinner parties, who counted corporate executives and Nobel laureates among his contacts, who had just spent a semester as a fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He smiled when he saw Chitwood. "Search what?" he said. Chitwood handed him the warrant and his team began to search. They found clothing. They found journals, 60 handwritten volumes of them. They found boxes stacked in a closet on the back porch. They found Holly Maddox's ID cards, which immediately told Chitwood something. No woman he'd ever investigated had left everything behind. At the very bottom of that closet, beneath the boxes, was a locked steamer trunk. Chitwood broke the lock with a crowbar. Inside were plastic bags and old newspapers from 1977, a layer of foam, and then I came across a mummified hand, Chitwood later said. He stopped. He called the medical examiner. Holly Maddox's skull had been fractured in six or more places. She had been dead for 18 months. Chitwood turned to the man standing in the doorway watching all of this. "It looks like we found Holly," he said. Ira Einhorn looked at him. "You found what you found," he replied. To understand why Ira Einhorn was able to do what he did and almost get away with it for 2 decades, you have to understand what he was in Philadelphia in the late 1960s and 1970s. He was, by most accounts, extraordinary. Born on May 15, 1940, into a middle-class Jewish family in Philadelphia, Einhorn graduated from the University of Pennsylvania in 1961 with a degree in English. He was brilliant, energetic, and possessed of what nearly everyone who met him described as a magnetic, almost irresistible personal force. He read vicariously across disciplines: physics, ecology, philosophy, Eastern religion, and could hold court with equal conviction in front of a corporate boardroom or a counterculture rally. In Philadelphia's intellectual and activist circles of the 1970s, he was what people called a planetary enzyme, his own term, and one he used without apparent irony. He saw himself as someone who catalyzed connections between people, between ideas, between movements. He was friends with Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin. He was also friends with CEOs of Fortune 500 companies who paid him consulting fees to explain the counterculture to them and tell them what was coming next. He was a speaker at the inaugural Earth Day event in Philadelphia on April 22, 1970, a fact he would later claim gave him co-founder status. The actual organizers of Earth Day have consistently disputed this. What is accurate is that he was present, that he spoke, and that his association with the event added to his public profile considerably. He taught briefly at Temple University and held a fellowship at Penn. In 1977, the year Holly Maddux disappeared, he was a fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He was also, according to those who knew him well, something quite different in private. Behind the charm, Einhorn was controlling, self-centered, and prone to violence toward the women he was involved with. He was a serial womanizer who expected the women in his life to subordinate themselves to his needs. He reportedly never paid for his own meals. He borrowed money he didn't return. He was described by acquaintances as having no real emotional reciprocity. When he was interested in you, you were the only thing in the world. When he wasn't, you ceased to exist. One of his old friends, a man named Keegan, later put it plainly: around women, Ira was a stunted teenager. He was all-brained, no heart. Helen Holly Maddux was born in Tyler, Texas, and was, by every account, someone with both deep roots and a restless spirit. She grew up in a conservative family headed by a proud World War II veteran. She was voted most likely to succeed by her high school class. She was a cheerleader with a love for art and nature, and by the time she arrived at Bryn Mawr College, a prestigious women's liberal arts college near Philadelphia, a clearly independent mind that was trying to find its place in the world. She met Ira in 1972 at a Philadelphia bistro called La Terrace where Einhorn regularly held court. She was described as possessing an almost ethereal, fragile beauty. Friends later compared her to Michelle Pfeiffer. She and Einhorn moved in together within weeks of meeting. From the beginning, their relationship was imbalanced. Einhorn was louder, more domineering, more certain of himself in every room. Holly, according to friends and her sister Elizabeth Hall, was repeatedly put down, ordered around, and treated by Einhorn as a subordinate. When the Maddux family visited, Einhorn went out of his way to be obnoxious, scratching at skin conditions during graze, dismissing Holly's views, treating her family with contempt. He was trying to create a rift between Holly and our father, her sister Elizabeth later said. And yet, Holly stayed. For 5 years she stayed. Those who knew her believed it was a combination of his magnetism, her own search for identity after leaving the structure of Tyler, and the psychological dynamics of a controlling relationship that are far easier to see from the outside than to escape from within. In 1977, she finally left. She moved to New York City, where she became involved with a man named Saul Lapidus, a relationship that, prosecutors would later argue, was the direct trigger for what followed. After Holly left Einhorn and moved to New York, Einhorn made contact with her. He told her that if she didn't come back to collect her belongings from the apartment they had shared, he would throw everything she owned into the street. It was a threat, and Holly, according to the account later reconstructed by investigators and recounted by Detective Chitwood, took it seriously. She arranged to return to Philadelphia on September 9, 1977. Before she came, she told Saul Lapidus, her boyfriend in New York, that she would be briefly returning to Einhorn's apartment to collect her things. She expected to be back quickly. She was never seen again. Several weeks after Holly's disappearance, Philadelphia police questioned Einhorn about where she was. He told them she had gone out to the neighborhood food co-op to buy tofu and sprouts and simply never came back. He expressed puzzlement. He expressed concern. He was Ira Einhorn, charming, credible, widely vouched for. The police, according to later reporting, were not sufficiently suspicious at that stage to push further. Einhorn, meanwhile, continued his life almost without interruption. He gave lectures, he attended dinner parties, he held his usual court at La Terrace. He was seen around the neighborhood, shopping, socializing, living as if nothing had happened. In the apartment on 3411 Ray Street, 18 months passed. Then the neighbors started to complain about the smell. It was, by one of history's darkest coincidences, the same morning that 3 Mile Island began leaking radiation into the Pennsylvania air, a nuclear crisis that Einhorn had allegedly predicted days earlier in his journal and that, he later claimed, proved the depth of his psychic and political insight. None of that mattered at approximately 8:50 a.m. when Michael Chitwood and his team climbed those stairs. The search of the apartment was systematic and thorough. Chitwood found the porch closet crammed with boxes. He found Holly's ID cards and other personal effects and immediately understood their significance. He moved toward the steamer trunk at the bottom of the closet. According to Chitwood's later account, you could smell what was inside before you opened it. He broke the lock with a crowbar. Inside were old newspapers from 1977, plastic bags, and a layer of foam. Beneath the foam, a mummified hand. He stopped and called the medical examiner. When the trunk was fully examined, it contained the partial remains of Holly Maddux, mummified, partially decomposed, her skull fractured in 6 or more places from blunt force trauma. Einhorn had been sleeping less than 10 feet from that trunk for 18 months. Chitwood turned and told Einhorn what they had found. "You found what you found," Einhorn said. He was arrested and charged with murder the same day. And then, in a sequence of events that still makes investigators' blood boil 4 decades later, he was released. On April 3, 1979, Ira Einhorn appeared before Judge William M. Marutani for a bail hearing. His attorney was Arlen Specter, formerly Philadelphia's district attorney, soon to be elected to the United States Senate. What happened at that hearing became one of the most extraordinary displays of social capital in Philadelphia legal history. Specter produced a parade of character witnesses, professors, lawyers, civic leaders, intellectuals, activists. One by one, Philadelphia's establishment stood up and testified into Einhorn's nonviolent character, his contributions to public life, his essential goodness. The picture they painted was of a gentle, responsible, free spirit, a man of peace who could not possibly have committed this crime. The judge set bail at $40,000, an amount described by legal observers at the time as extraordinarily low for a murder charge, in an era where pretrial release in murder cases was itself unusual. Einhorn posted 10%, $4,000, and walked out. The $4,000 was paid by Barbara Bronfman, a Montreal socialite who had married into the wealthy Bronfman distillery family. She and Einhorn shared an interest in the paranormal. She believed in him completely. Outside, Einhorn told anyone who would listen that the whole thing was a conspiracy. The CIA, he claimed, had planted Holly's body in his closet because he knew too much about their research into psychotronics, the use of psychic energy as a military weapon. They wanted to discredit him and shut down his network. Some people believed him, or at least they wanted to. Einhorn returned to his life. He continued networking. He maintained his connections. He prepared, ostensibly, for trial. The trial was scheduled for early 1981. In January of that year, just 2 days before proceedings were set to begin, Ira Einhorn boarded a flight to London. He would not set foot on American soil again for 20 years. A bench warrant for Einhorn's arrest was issued on January 14, 1981, when he failed to appear for a pretrial hearing. By then, he was already gone. He is believed to have left through Canada and then crossed to Europe. He settled first in Ireland, where he lived under the name Ben Moore and built a quiet circle of friends who had no idea who he was. He was spotted there in 1981 and again in 1984 and 1986, but each time, international legal complications prevented his arrest, and then he disappeared again. In 1988, he narrowly escaped arrest in Stockholm. By then, the man leading the hunt was Richard D. Benedetto, an assistant district attorney in Philadelphia who ran the extraditions office, and who had read Einhorn's 60 handwritten journals so thoroughly he said he knew his target better than almost anyone alive. By the early 1990s, Einhorn had settled in the French countryside, in a coveted mill house outside a beautiful rural commune called Champagne-Motin, near Cognac. He had a new identity, Eugene Malone, and he had a wife, Annika Flodden, a Swedish woman he had met and married abroad, who provided him financial support, believed in his innocence completely, and helped maintain the fiction of his assumed name. He was, by the account of those who encountered him in France, relaxed and intellectually active. He gardened, he cooked, he surfed the early internet, he worked on manuscripts he claimed to be preparing for publication. He and Annika shopped for goat cheese and pâté at the local market and chatted with vendors. He had, to all appearances, built a pleasant life. Back in Philadelphia, Holly Maddux's family was living a different reality. Her father, who had never seen justice for his daughter's murder, took his own life in 1988. Her mother died of illness 2 years later. Her 4 siblings, Meg, John, Buffy, and Mary, kept pursuing the case, working with retired FBI agents, feeding information to D. Benedetto, refusing to let the trail go cold. In Pennsylvania, in September 1993, a court tried Ira Einhorn in absentia and convicted him of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. He was in France and did not attend. Then, in 1994, a crucial break came. Barbara Bronfman, the woman who had paid Einhorn's bail in 1979 and had continued financing his flight for years, had read Stephen Levy's 1988 book about the case, The Unicorn Secret. It had changed her mind. She contacted Di Benedetto and provided the Stockholm address where she had last been sending money. That address led to Annika Flodden. Flodden had moved to France. Following her, investigators found Eugene Malone, Ira Einhorn, in Champagne-Motin. On June 13, 1997, 20 years after Holly Maddux had walked into that Philadelphia apartment for the last time, French police arrested Ira Einhorn. The arrest in France was not the end. It was the beginning of a 4-year legal battle that became, for Holly Maddux's family, almost as agonizing as the fugitive years themselves. Under French law, and more broadly under the European Convention on Human Rights, a person cannot be extradited to face a sentence from a trial at which they were not present. The in absentia conviction in Pennsylvania gave Einhorn's French lawyers a powerful argument. If he were returned to the United States, he would go directly to prison under a sentence he had had no opportunity to contest. The initial French court agreed. Einhorn was released in late 1997 on bail to await further proceedings. He and Anika went back to their mill house, bought their vegetables, and gave interviews to American journalists in which Einhorn expressed mild amusement at the whole situation. In January 1998, the Pennsylvania legislature passed a new law specifically designed to resolve the extradition impasse. It guaranteed any previously convicted defendant who had been tried in absentia the right to a full new trial upon return to the United States. This became known informally as the Einhorn Law. With the double jeopardy and fair trial arguments addressed, extradition proceedings resumed. Einhorn's legal team continued to fight, arguing constitutional issues, appealing to the Council d'Etat, France's highest administrative court, and ultimately to the European Court of Human Rights. Every appeal failed. In July 2001, facing the end of his legal options, Einhorn gave a final public demonstration of his character. In front of television cameras, he took a butter knife and drew it across his throat, a theatrical gesture he later presented as a suicide attempt. The knife was too dull to cause serious injury. The medical examination confirmed minor superficial marks. On July 20th, 2001, Ira Einhorn was loaded onto a flight in Paris, handcuffed, wearing a bulletproof vest, and transported to Philadelphia International Airport. He arrived at approximately 4 a.m. He said nothing as he was let off the plane. Holly Maddux's sister Meg Wakeman was waiting. "Holly's day is now beginning," she said. "This is the day for the person who really suffered the most. This is all for her." The trial of Ira Einhorn began on September 2002, 25 years after Holly Maddux's death. Prosecutor Joel Rosen, who had prosecuted the original 1993 in absentia case, led the Commonwealth's case. The physical evidence was substantial and straightforward. The body found in Einhorn's locked trunk, the forensic confirmation that Holly had been dead since approximately September 1977, the skull fractures consistent with repeated blunt force trauma, Holly's belongings found throughout the apartment, testimony from multiple witnesses about Einhorn's controlling and violent behavior toward women who tried to leave him. A former girlfriend testified that Einhorn had been physically violent with her when she attempted to end their relationship, establishing a pattern of behavior that the prosecution argued explained exactly what happened when Holly Maddux came back for her belongings. Prosecutors also introduced extensive passages from Einhorn's personal journals and a poem he had written titled An Act of Violence, referencing a bottle as a weapon, which they argued demonstrated his private state of mind and contradicted his public persona. The defense, led by former Senator Arlen Specter, who returned to represent Einhorn again, attempted to argue that someone else could have placed the body in the trunk during a period when Einhorn claimed to have been away from the apartment for several months in 1978. They also attempted to challenge the constitutionality of the Einhorn Law, arguing it violated double jeopardy protections. The judge refused to hear arguments on that question. Then Ira Einhorn took the stand. He presented the same theory he had been offering for 20 years. CIA agents had killed Holly Maddux and planted her body in his closet to destroy his credibility because of his research into psychotronics, the paranormal military programs he claimed were at the center of Cold War intelligence operations. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. On October 17, 2002, they found Ira Einhorn guilty of first-degree murder. The following day, he was sentenced to a mandatory life term without the possibility of parole. He was 62 years old. Ira Einhorn began serving his sentence at the Pennsylvania State Correctional Institution in Howardsdale. He continued, by all accounts, to maintain his innocence from behind bars. He filed appeals. The Superior Court of Pennsylvania unanimously affirmed his sentence in November 2006. He gave occasional interviews. He claimed the trial had been politically motivated. He maintained that he had been framed. He never acknowledged Holly Maddux's death as something he had caused. In 1999, before the criminal trial, the Maddux family had won a civil wrongful death suit against Einhorn. The jury awarded them $907 million in damages. Einhorn, imprisoned and with no significant assets, could not pay. But the judgment ensured that if he ever profited from his story, through books, interviews, or any commercial arrangements, Those proceeds will go to Holly's family. Holly's parents never saw justice. Her father died by suicide in 1988. Her mother died of illness in 1990. But her siblings, who had spent decades advocating, grieving, and refusing to give up, were alive to see the conviction. On April 3rd, 2020, Ira Einhorn died of natural causes at the SCI Laurel Highlands in Pennsylvania. He was 79. He had served 18 years of his life sentence. He never confessed. And then there's the question that Earth Day brings back every year. Einhorn claimed for decades to have been an instrumental force behind the first Earth Day in 1970. Environmental organizations and Earth Day historians have consistently pushed back on this claim. Senator Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin, who is widely recognized as Earth Day's primary founder, did not credit Einhorn as a co-founder. Einhorn was present, he spoke, and he was a part of Philadelphia's counterculture network that helped promote the event locally. But the claim that he founded or co-founded Earth Day is disputed and not supported by the historical record. What is not in dispute is that his photograph circulated on social media in the years following his conviction, falsely presented as evidence that Earth Day had been founded by a murderer. This narrative was used by someone to discredit the environmental movement. Fact-checkers at multiple outlets, including Time magazine, have addressed and corrected this claim. The truth is simpler and more uncomfortable. Einhorn was a genuine figure in the counterculture environmental movement, a genuinely brilliant and well-connected man, and a killer who spent 20 years living freely in Europe while Holly Maddux's family lost two parents to grief and waited for justice. He fooled a lot of people for a very long time. The $40,000 bail, with only $4,000 required in cash, was widely criticized at the time and remains a troubling aspect of this case. The answer lies partly in Einhorn's extraordinary social capital. The parade of establishment figures who showed up to vouch for him at the bail hearing created a portrait that was difficult for the judge to see past. Whether his connections actively influenced the outcome or whether the judge simply failed to weigh the evidence appropriately has never been resolved. What is clear is that without that bail hearing, Einhorn never would have had the opportunity to flee. And without the flight, Holly Maddux's family might have seen justice before her parents died. Barbara Bronfman funded Einhorn's flight for over a decade before she changed her mind after reading The Unicorn Secret. No charges were ever filed against her. The European network of intellectuals and left-leaning activists who supported his narrative, framing him as a political exile rather than a fugitive murderer, allowed him to move relatively freely throughout Ireland, the UK, Sweden, and France. Whether any of his supporters had a reason to know he was guilty or whether they were genuinely deceived has never been legally determined. Einhorn's defense that the CIA murdered Holly and planted her body in his closet was presented at trial and rejected by the jury in 2 hours. It had never been substantiated by any evidence. It is mentioned here only because it was his consistent public claim for 25 years, and because understanding how a man of his intelligence could maintain it tells you something important about how controlling, narcissistic personalities construct alternative realities to avoid accountability. Detective Chitwood made an observation after the case closed that is worth sitting with. He noted that if Einhorn had simply called the police after killing Holly, if he had reported her death, claimed there was an argument that escalated, and pleaded guilty to a lesser charge in 1977, he likely would have served 5 or 6 years and had been released. Instead, he hid her body in a trunk for 18 months, fled the country, lived as a fugitive for 20 years, and ultimately died in prison. The longest sentence, in the end, was self-imposed. Before I go, I want to leave you with one thing. Ira Einhorn charmed almost everyone he met. Senators vouched for him. Socialites paid his bail. European courts fought to protect his rights. Intellectuals on 2 continents accepted his conspiracy theories. For nearly 2 decades, a significant portion of the people who encountered him chose to believe the man, not the evidence. And this is not a story about how unusual this is. It's a story about how common it is. The question this case raises, and doesn't answer, is how we evaluate people whose public persona and private reality are that far apart. Einhorn's public self was constructed with real skill and over many years. The counterculture gave him cover. His social network gave him protection. His intelligence gave him credibility. None of it had to do with who he actually was in that apartment on Ray Street. What do you make of the bail hearing? The judge had the evidence in front of him. A body in a trunk found in a man's locked apartment. An art inspector walked with the who's who of Philadelphia and secured a $40,000 bond. Does social capital explain it? Or was it something else? Leave your thoughts below. This is one of those cases where the story around the crime is almost as disturbing as the crime itself. If you want to go deeper, Stephen Levy's book, The Unicorn Secret, is a definitive account. He had access to Einhorn's journals and interviewed everyone while the case was still unfolding. The 1999 NBC miniseries The Hunt for the Unicorn Killer, starring Naomi Watts and Kevin Anderson, dramatizes the fugitive years in detail. Hit subscribe if you want to stay with cases like this one. See you next time.